Welcome to Global One Media's Stocks to Watch. I'm Michael Switow. We have a very special conversation for you today, one that might sound like science fiction, but is indeed quite real. Our guest is Siddharth Jadhav. He's the founder and CEO of a Singapore-based company called Polybee that is creating a buzz in the world of agriculture. And they're doing it with drones that function like bees. Yes, Polybee's drones are designed to pollinate plants and do much more, and they could potentially be a solution to an existential crisis facing our planet. I don't use that term lightly. We'll dive into all the details in just a moment as we take a look at drone bees. But first, Sid, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so you founded Polybee about 4 to 5 years ago after studying drone aerodynamics in university. Got to say, I didn't even know that was a subject. I guess that dates me a bit. Tell us, what attracted you to bees? Why try to create a drone that functions like them?
My background is in research, as you pointed out, in fundamental aerodynamics. And I was studying more specifically drones at the National University of Singapore as a research scientist. And how I ended up looking into this problem was really a sequence of serendipitous events. And at the university, there were a number of programs which were encouraging researchers to explore the commercial potential of their projects and research skills. And around that time, there was a lot of conversation around vertical farming and indoor farming in Singapore, given its, sort of existential question about food security. So that's how I got introduced to indoor agriculture as an industry. And with my background in drones, I joined one of these programs where we were encouraged to explore the commercial potential of our projects. And that's where it was a thread that I just pulled out of curiosity. What problems could we solve in indoor farming? And my first step was to just try and build something if it even gets close to solving a problem like pollination in indoor farms. And the reason why I thought that problem was worth looking into is because you cannot use bees indoors. Right? Bees need a certain spectrum of light, which includes ultraviolet, which they get from the sun, to navigate around. Just the way we see red, green, and blue colors, bees see ultraviolet as one of those colors. And when it's missing,
so basically, just to jump in for a second, in an indoor farm, and Singapore had the world's first vertical farm. In these vertical farms, the bees essentially get lost. Is that right? They just can't see their way around.
That's correct. Yes. And that's how it got started, right? So our first intention was to just build a prototype and see if drones can pollinate flowers in an indoor vertical farm. But then, what initially seemed like a pond of opportunity ended up being a sea of opportunity. And what I mean by that is, the problem of pollination is not just valid in vertical farms, but more so also in greenhouse agriculture, because that problem also is prevalent in greenhouse agriculture, where there's only one species of bees that can pollinate crops, and that is bumblebees. We cannot use honeybees in a greenhouse. They're even more disoriented in under shelter. And the problem about bumblebees is that they're not available across the world. If you're in Northern America or let's say in China, you might take it for granted, or Europe for that matter, you might take it for granted that bumblebees are available. But in the rest of the world, there are no bumblebees. You cannot import them either, right? So all greenhouse growers in all of these countries have no solution for pollination, and that is such an essential step, in terms of producing fruit crops like tomatoes and strawberries. So through my sort of pursuit of curiosity, I ended up realizing that, hey, this is a big problem, and maybe just a hunch I had that maybe it could be solved with drones. Let's give it a shot, and that's really how the journey started.
I've seen videos in these indoor farms of people pollinating plants by hand, because like you said, the bees aren't there, they can't do it. And it just looks like excruciatingly hard and difficult and time consuming. So I understand the problem you're trying to solve. Give us a quick primer. How do drone bees work?
Correct. So I guess the first thing to understand here is how pollination works and why it's important, right? So all the food produce that we eat, a big part of it at least, is a result of the step of pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the male part of the flower to the female part of the flower, right? And pollination classifies into two main types. One is called self-pollination, the other is called cross-pollination. And the differentiation lies between how the male and female parts of the flower are distributed. Now, going back to the problem that we are solving, we looked at the entire spectrum of all the produce that we consume, And we realized that, okay, the split of crops which are self-pollinating and cross-pollinating is more or less the same, right? So for example, tomatoes, strawberries are self-pollinating crops. Avocados, cherries, apple are cross-pollinating crops. And then we realized that, okay, if we have to really solve this problem at scale, let's try to, pick the low-hanging fruit, pun not intended. And then we realized that it's perhaps easier to pollinate self-pollinating crops like tomatoes and strawberries. So basically, that's the first step then, right? Okay, what do we pollinate of all the crops? It should be self-pollinating crops. Now, how does the solution really work, right? And here's where we developed a bio-inspired method for self-pollination, right? Because the problem at hand is, let's say if you have to pollinate a tomato flower or strawberry flower, what you really need to do is shake the flower so that the pollen grains from the male part fall onto the female parts within the same flower, right? That is what bees are doing for us for this class of crops. So we achieve the same objective using drones. But instead of having to have any contact with the flowers, what we do is we leverage the turbulent airflow from the propellers of drones to vibrate the flowers at just the right frequencies, as if a bumblebee would vibrate it, with its muscles. And that is what would get pollination done. So
I love
the
the phrase you
method,
use there, bio-inspired. So you looked at what's happening in the natural world, you looked at the
yeah,
vibrations, the frequencies that bees are using, and then you tried
correct.
to replicate that with the drones. Now, you're doing this mainly in the indoor farms, and what I think a lot of people don't realize is the world is facing a bee crisis. Species are going extinct, populations have decreased dramatically over the past 2 decades, and yet they play such a vital role in food production, mainly in the outside farms and in the wild. They pollinate fruits, vegetables, nuts. I'm curious,
Yeah.
while you're focused on the indoor farms right now and the vertical farms, is it possible that your solution could help outdoor agriculture as well?
I think in principle, yes. Although the mechanism that we have to develop so far and have proven its efficacy for is limited to self-pollinating crops, which is like I said, I mentioned tomatoes, by the way, the biggest fresh produce crop in the world, followed by other high-value crops such as berries. So we're already covering a big part of the market, if you will, in terms of sheer volume of production. But even if you look at those other high value crops that are grown mostly outdoors, as you mentioned, nut crops, and other fruits like avocados and apples and cherries, those crops are cross pollinating, right? Which means that you need to transfer pollen from flower A or plant A to flower B or plant B, right? So there's an additional step here in terms of what needs to be automated, which is to collect the pollen and transfer it to the female plants or female flowers, right? So in terms of automation, it's more complex, but I think we learn a lot as we're first solving the problem of self-pollination in greenhouses, where all you need to do is use the airflow from the drone's propellers for pollination. There's no picking and placing of pollen, if you will. Whereas in cross-pollinating crops, we'll have to build towards that capability. But we do see the potential there because we have the foundations in place. We have autonomous drone fleets flying around at a very high frequency and in terms of their number of flights, operating hours. So we know really how to leverage this autonomous system in the future.
So you mentioned tomatoes and strawberries, and so far your company has been primarily focused, I believe, on those two crops. You've done some tests in Australia. What have the results been like?
So we've seen incredibly promising results. And Australia is a very unique market to look at because the entire continent does not have bumblebees. What this means is all pollination done in greenhouses is by hand. So it's extremely expensive. It's very inconsistent. It's very dependent on availability of labor. And given how critical that step is in terms of the quality and the volume of production, growers in Australia have been looking for a solution for decades. And when we entered that market, we partnered with Horticulture Innovation Australia, which is one of the most important entities in terms of research and development in the sector. And they helped us get in touch with the biggest growers in the country. Since the last year, we've run multiple trials with three of the biggest growers that represent more than 50% of the tomato greenhouse market. And with all of them, we've proven our solution to be successful in trials. We started off with a very small scale. We looked at a few rows in a greenhouse to begin with. But today we're already deploying over a few hectares with some of these customers. And in the coming 2 years, we're looking at tens of hectares where we'll deploy our autonomous fleets of drones for pollination. So we've proven that the method of pollination works as well as the growers would like. We've proven that any labor involved in this, in this extensive process can be mitigated by more than 95% in terms of the hours spent, and the fact that this solution is stable enough for them to move on to a completely new way of doing things.
So you've shown that it can be scaled up, that takes a lot less time, and I believe the yields have improved as well, correct?
That's exactly right.
So I got to ask you, I get that your solution has an important role to play, but how do the vegetables and fruit taste? Does it taste as good as something which is organically pollinated?
Well, the taste of a fruit depends on a number of factors, of which pollination is definitely one of the most important ones because how well a flower is pollinated determines the size and shape and the sugar levels in the fruit. So as long as the flower is pollinated really well, it tastes amazing, and that's exactly what we've proven. We pollinate these flowers at a very high level of quality, and that ends up in delicious produce.
All right, well, I'd like to try some of those strawberries sometime. Let's
Indeed.
turn to the business side of the equation now. And I realize in this conversation, we've largely focused on just one part of your business, the drone bees. You're also involved in the business of forecasting and improving agricultural yields. So tell us, how big do you think is the size of your target market?
That's an excellent question, Michael. So, one of the reasons why we looked at pollination as a problem to solve is because of its impact on the productivity in fresh produce. Right? Fresh produce is such a massive sector in itself. The total farm gate value of everything that we grow and consume in this world is in excess of $1 trillion. Right? And a big part of that depends entirely on pollination, which is why we looked at it as a problem to solve. But that's one of those means of increasing productivity in fresh produce. A big part of fresh produce, in terms of its profitability, also depends on pricing. Right? If you look at grain crops, on the other hand, there's not a lot of price volatility because you can store them. But when you look at fresh produce, because of its perishability, there's only so much time that a grower has to sell it, right? Which means they're often price takers. So if we provide the right information to growers at the right time in terms of how much harvest they're expecting in the next few days, they can strike better deals with their retailers and get a good price for it, right? So that's why we looked at yield forecasting as another solution for growers, because it helps them improve the productivity of their business. And all in all, these two problems, when solved together, pollination, where on the one hand, we improve the quality as it's being grown. On the other hand, we help them forecast how much they're expecting in the next few days and weeks. Really gives them a solid chance of improving their economics, right? So that's why we are looking at these two problems to solve. In terms of our market size, right? I think there's so much potential to disrupt in terms of productivity, and we could facilitate gains as much as 20 to 30% in a certain segment, purely based on better pricing from our forecasts and higher quality pollination. And like I said, the fresh produce market in itself is clearly above $1 trillion. So we're really looking at least a few tens of billions of dollars worth of potential for us to move the needle when it comes to productivity in fresh produce.
So you mentioned pricing and yield. So I want to get to the pricing of your product. Are drone bees expensive to make?
Well, the way our solution works is that it has two components. One is the hardware, which is the drone fleet, and the other is software. We do not manufacture our own drones. We have partnered with some of the biggest drone manufacturers in the world, and we leverage their high quality, affordable, reliable hardware and their support systems in all parts of the world. And how our business model works is that our customers own that hardware as their own assets. It's capital expenditure for them because our typical customer profile ends up being a capex heavy business, so they're happy to happy to own that for themselves. What we charge them for is the software subscription. It's a solution that really does the forecasting of yield using computer vision and AI, where we collect all this data from drone cameras, we process it, and then we make a forecast. So we have a subscription service for that. And when it comes to pollination, our subscription service is for the autonomous software, which is basically what runs all the fleets of drones. So all in all, our value proposition to growers is very clear. They're not going to spend anything more than what they did previously for forecasting or for pollination in terms of labor costs. But in fact, we're going to improve their productivity even further. So the ROI for what they spend on our service is fully justified, and they're going to get multiples in returns for what we charge them.
So it's interesting. If I'm a farmer, I go out and I buy the drones, but then I subscribe to your service on a monthly basis, both for the yield forecasting and for the software that runs the drones to make them pollinate and serve that function as bees. Really
That's exactly
fascinating.
right.
So artificial intelligence are two of the biggest words on Wall Street right now. And I understand that you're using AI in your programs. And you actually started doing this well before all the buzz about AI took Wall Street by storm. So tell us, how do your bees use artificial intelligence? And how are advances in AI impacting your business?
Yeah, I think that's a great question to ponder over. And you're right. We started on this journey before it was a buzzword in agriculture, at least. Um, so where we are largely leveraging our AI capabilities today is in yield forecasting, and the reason is that this is the biggest unsolved commercial problem in fresh produce today. It's $1 trillion industry. And I can tell you that none of the crops that we grow today have a scalable, reliable solution to forecast yield. A lot of companies have tried using just historical data, their own judgment, growers' expertise to try and forecast yield, but none of that has worked to a point where it can move the needle for their business. And this is where we saw the potential of AI, because what we're doing here is, in order to forecast yield better, we're just going out there and we're looking at the produce with the drone's cameras to be able to characterize, okay, how many fruits are there on these farms, what is their size, what is their weight, what is the weather forecast, and based on all of these parameters, what are we expecting in the next few days in terms of being able to harvest and measure the volume of this yield, right? And all of that is facilitated by today's cutting edge abilities of AI models, right? So, for example, we've trained our own models to be able to detect all of these fruits in imagery. We use our AI models to make reconstructions or digital twins of these fruits so that we know their size, we know their weight, and all of this, is facilitated by the recent advances, right? We could see that happen, 4 years ago when we started on this journey. That it's only a question of time where you're going to be able to scale these technologies and you're going to be able to tell very accurately what yield you're expecting, because we're combining so many data streams together, right? So that's how we've leveraged AI so far in forecasting, which is such a hard problem with multiple data streams, and we've seen great success so far.
So not only is Polybee the drone bee company, it's also
Mhm.
the AI agricultural company.
That's exactly right, Michael. I think it's very important to acknowledge that we are here for growers, right? Our objective is to increase productivity for the sector, and we are willing to build all technology pillars that help us in that mission. Be it drones, be it AI. We build all the pillars that we need to achieve our overarching objective. So yes, absolutely. Those are the two core pillars of our technology. One is automation of drones, and the other is AI.
So Polybee is not publicly traded yet, but you might go public in future. How much money have you raised so far? And are you looking for new institutional partners to come on board?
So Polybee is about 4 years old. We are, I would say, an early stage deep tech startup. We have raised about $3 million in funding so far, and our investors include, Singapore government venture capital arm, which seeds capital, Elevate VC, a famous deep tech investor from Singapore, and we've also raised a number of grants from various institutions in Singapore and in Australia. So we're fairly early stage. Our laser focus right now is on product market fit. We've done all our work in de-risking and proving our technology's efficacy. We've proven its scalability. And in the next 2 years, our focus is on growing our solution in terms of its footprint with our existing customers and new ones. And in that time frame is when we'll start looking at growth capital to fuel our full potential. So we anticipate that in the coming couple of years.
At the beginning of this conversation, I referenced science fiction, and I said that you're working in the here and now. You're also focused here on the ground on Earth, but I understand there could be a market for drone bees in space. Scientists are already planning to bring living insects to space to work as pollinators. Do you think drones could be more effective? Are we going to see drone bees in space one day?
Absolutely. I think I can't wait for an opportunity for us to test that out. Essentially, you're right that if there's any produce that needs to be grown in space, you do need pollination, and I think astronauts have better jobs to do than hand pollinate some of these flowers in their fully controlled space farms. So I'm pretty sure we could give them a hand.
All right. Well, I can't wait to see that. And I think you all are right on the doorstep of it. Very exciting. Sid, thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Thank you very much, Michael. It's been a pleasure.
We've been speaking with Polybee CEO and founder Siddharth Jadhav, and you've been watching Global One Media's Stocks to Watch. I'm Michael Switow.